Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be around the globe. Welcome to this presentation on Sefarad, A Journey Through Time and Space. With that, let me just share my PowerPoint for everyone here. I am Dr. Isaac Amon, and I am the Director of Research and Project Development at Jewish Heritage Alliance, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to encapsulate and promote the saga of Sefarad, an incredibly sweeping segment of Jewish and global history, to the world at large. Today, due to limited time constraints, and of course, the great expanses of space and time we're going to cover, I can only give what is effectively a 30,000-foot overview of the saga by looking at some key events, some key figures and highlights. And if anyone has questions, wants to know more details, we can certainly get to that in a Q&A. And I will provide my contact information in case anyone wishes to contact me afterwards for further information. So with that, let's get started. Whence comes the term Sefarad? Where does it originate from? It appears in the book of Obadiah, one of the 12 minor prophets in Jewish history, and there is a reference in chapter 1, verse 20 to this location. Now, although it is ambiguous, from the earliest days of antiquity, over 2 millennia ago, Jewish tradition strongly came to identify Sefarad with the Iberian Peninsula, with the countries of Spain and Portugal. And so situating ourselves geographically as we begin this journey almost 3,000 years ago, as you can see on the map, the Iberian Peninsula here in green forms the westernmost appendage of the European continent. It is bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to its west and northwest, by the Mediterranean Sea to its east, by the Pyrenees mountain range, which separates Spain from France in the northeast, and at its narrowest point in the south, it is separated from Morocco, and hence the African continent, by a very narrow body of water, the Straits of Gibraltar. And so the Iberian Peninsula truly sits at the confluence of countries, cultures, and civilizations, which over the centuries produced a uniquely Iberian ethos. Zooming in on the left, we can see the Iberian Peninsula, which again comprises the countries of Spain, as you can see here in the darker green or turquoise color, which comprises the vast majority of it, and its smaller and western neighbor, Portugal, here in the light green, which abuts the Atlantic Ocean. And so the question becomes, right off the bat, when did Jews arrive in the Iberian Peninsula? When did they come to the biblical Sefarad? Jewish tradition holds they came in the time of the First Temple, or the first Beit HaMikdash. And this view has been advanced, although it's not conclusively proven, because we know from history and parts of Tanakh, or the biblical canon, that King Solomon, who constructed the first temple, had an extremely close alliance and relationship with Hiram, who was the Phoenician king of Tyre, located in what is now modern-day Lebanon. And the Tanakh tells us that Hiram actually helped to construct the first temple in Jerusalem. Moreover, the two kingdoms, as you can see, they're very close to one another, jointly engaged in trading missions or maritime expeditions to far-flung places. And so the Phoenicians were a great seafaring peoples, and being expert mariners, they traversed the length and breadth of the Mediterranean basin. They established colonies, trading centers, and settlements throughout the Levant and Israel, Lebanon, Syria, up into Turkey, throughout North Africa, parts of Southern Europe and the islands in the Mediterranean, and they came to the Iberian Peninsula. And indeed, tradition holds the Phoenicians founded the cities of Cadiz and Malaga in Spain, and Lisbon or Lisboa in Portugal. And so because of the alliance between the kingdoms of Israel, or the unified monarchy, and Phoenicia, and the very close personal relationship between Hiram and Solomon, it's quite eminently reasonable to conclude that Jewish merchants, sailors, traders, accompanied their Phoenician counterparts as they sailed due west and wound up in the Iberian Peninsula. Notwithstanding if this tradition is historically accurate, what most scholars conclude based on documentary and archaeological evidence is that Jewish communal life and presence did not really come about until much later, during the time of the Roman Empire, particularly by the 1st century of the Common Era. And three primary sources that provide insight into this are the New Testament, which details the travels of the Apostle Paul, formerly known as Saul of Tarsus, who underwent his dramatic conversion to Christianity on the famed road to Damascus. And he preached the gospel of Jesus' messiahship to Jew and Gentile alike, but to Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean. And in his epistle to the Romans, he expressly made known his desire to venture as far west as Spain to preach the gospel. And so this has led scholars to conclude he wished to travel to the ends of the earth, at least in ancient times, because there were well-settled Jewish communities there. A generation after Paul, the noted Jewish historian Josephus, as seen on the right, tells us in his great work, following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE by the Romans, to which he was an eyewitness, that the Romans dispersed that exile or remnant of the southern kingdom of Judah, comprising the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, throughout the lands in Europe and Asia under their domination and occupation, and this included Spain or Hispania. And fascinatingly, another source which confirms the existence of Jewish communities in Spain in the first few centuries of the Common Era is that of the Babylonian Talmud, that great compendium of rabbinic rulings and sayings interpreting ambiguities in the written text, or the Torah Shabbat, the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. Often the Talmud referred to itself as the Torah Shabbal Peh, or the oral law. And as you can see in these tractates, the rabbis or sages who are living in Babylon or modern day Iraq across the Mediterranean basin from Spain expressly or explicitly mention Spain, Hispania, and Cordoba. And so Jewish communities were well known even as far away as Iraq. And so together, these documentary sources certainly paint a portrait of a vibrant Jewish communal presence in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula by Roman times. Archaeologically, it's a bit more sparse. A gravestone of a young girl named Salo, who died in the 3rd century or so, was found in the city of Abdera, now known as Adra, and a stone bearing a trilingual inscription in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew was found in the city of Tarragona, dated to roughly the same time. But this archaeological evidence effectively bolsters the documentary source record that there were well-established Jewish communities in Roman times when they governed the Iberian Peninsula. Now, in the early 5th century, the Roman Empire gradually contracted, Germanic tribes invaded various parts of the empire. And so when Roman forces withdrew from Spain and other provinces, a power vacuum developed, and these Germanic tribes came in. And in the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths came to be masters of the peninsula. Now, initially, the Visigoths espoused a non-Trinitarian Christian creed based on the teachings of the Bishop Arius, later deemed to be a heresy by the Catholic Church. And this Arianism, as it was known, permitted the Visigoths to be relatively tolerant of other Christian creeds and Jews as well. In 587, however, King Recared famously converted from Arianism to Catholicism in an attempt to unify church and state. And following this, aggressive anti-Jewish measures were taken. Most infamously, a quarter century later in 613, his successor, King Sysabat, ordered the conversion or expulsion en masse of all Jewish communities living in the Visigothic kingdom. And it's estimated that even in the early 7th century, this ultimatum affected as many as 90,000 Jews who either submitted to baptism, becoming nominal Catholics, or they fled abroad, primarily to France or North Africa. And by the mid-7th century, the famous law code of the Visigoths, known as the Lex Visigothorum, was promulgated. And while in the legal literature it's revered as one of the most able codes of law that has come down to us, the stamp of its anti-Jewish animus is readily apparent. It tells us, quote, "We lament that the soil of our kingdom is still defiled by the infamy of the Jews." So accordingly, in a refrain that was neither the first nor the last time in history, key rituals were forbidden to be practiced. Jews could not practice kashrut, the dietary laws, circumcision, the Brit Milah, or observe the Shabbat. But the most significant clause of this code, which would have far-reaching consequences for Jewish, Christian, and Iberian history, is that it tells us, quote, "Jews, whether baptized or not, are forbidden to testify in court." And so this effectively created what some scholars have called the racialization of religion, whereby Judaism at this time ceased to be viewed as a matter of faith by the outside society and came to be viewed as something innately biological, something transmitted by blood or by race. And so the forcible conversions of the tens of thousands of Jews during the reign of Sysabat created an entirely new category of persons who were nominally Christians, but were secretly practicing or maintaining Jewish rites and rituals. And they came to be known as New Christians, as Cristianos Nuevos in Spain or Cristãos Novos in Portugal. effectively synonymous terms for these people and their descendants would be Marranos, Anusim, Conversos, or crypto-Jews. And significantly, as we see here, the very phenomenon of crypto-Judaism, which would come to greatly haunt, so to speak, Iberian history, was born in the mid-7th century. And 7 centuries later, the Inquisition would be created to definitively deal with it. Now, in 711, Visigothic rule comes to an end. The Muslims, under the leadership of Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar from North Africa and conquered much of the Iberian Peninsula. As you can see on the map, they conquered Portugal, south of Spain, central, all the way up into the northeast. And most of this was done within a decade or so. Christian and Muslim sources say that Jews aided in the rapidity of the conquest, and they worked so well together that the defense of cities in the south of Spain in the biblical Sefarad was actually left in the hands of the Jewish community. Christian kingdoms in the north at this time were disunited and effectively were just petty principalities. And so as a result of the Muslim conquest, this has given rise or birth to the so-called golden age of Sefarad, or of Sephardic Judaism, really marked by the fullest cultural flowering or efflorescence in the 200 years from the 10th to the 12th century, animated by the spirit of convivencia of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, children of the biblical Abraham or of Abraham Avinu, living with and working with one another in various fields of human endeavor and art and history and poetry and philosophy and in astronomy. And although Jews and Christians certainly didn't experience political or civic equality as we would understand it, it was a remarkable time period which produced an astonishing number of individuals who came to be famous in Jewish and non-Jewish history. And among them were Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who came to be the vizier or foreign minister to the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Rahman III. He corresponded with the Gaonim, the Talmudic academies in Babylon and modern-day Iraq that compiled and codified the Babylonian Talmud, and famously he corresponded with the Khazar Empire or kingdom that converted to Judaism en masse, immortalized in the famous work The Kuzari by the philosopher and poet Judah Halevi. Other key figures included Abraham ibn Ezra, the noted biblical commentator, Solomon ibn Gabirol, a reclusive and mystically inclined poet and philosopher, and of course the most significant figure to emerge from the golden age at the end of it, but the most fitting tribute was that, of course, of Maimonides, who was a philosopher, a physician, a legal codifier, and a scholar who became, of course, a physician to the noted Sultan Saladin, and who penned 2 magnificent treatises, which are widely read and revered to this day: his Mishneh Torah, his Great Code of Jewish Law, and his Moreh Nevuchim, or Guide for the Perplexed, an attempted synthesis of reason and faith in his own time. And so the late Maria Rosa Monaco at Yale University, as seen here, dubbed this incredible time period centered around the magnificent city of Cordoba, where Maimonides was from, the ornament of the world. Now, following the end of the Golden Age, Christian kingdoms in the north had gradually reunified and begun a process of reconquering much of the territories that had fallen to Muslims in the initial conquest of 711, in a period known as the Reconquista. This was to last centuries, and of course would finally be finished in 1492, as we shall see. But by the early 13th century, right after the death of Maimonides or so, the Muslims were reduced to a final bastion, that of the Kingdom of Granada in the south of Spain. And so while there were some enlightened Christian rulers who did protect Jews, who did and Muslims as well, we see the beginnings of Jewish life being deteriorated, and certainly see marked deterioration, a decline by the mid-14th century, with the arrival or the onset of the Black Death or bubonic plague, which devastated Europe, killing an estimated 30 to 60% of the population. Jewish communities were infamously vilified, scapegoated, and massacred across Europe. And this violence and rioting came to the Iberian Peninsula. Jewish quarters in Spain, especially in the Kingdom of Aragon, in Barcelona and other places, were assaulted and decimated, setting the stage for even more vicious riots and massacres, which were to occur 2 generations later in 1391. That summer saw an eruption of bloodshed across the Iberian Peninsula throughout the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. It's estimated that somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 Jews were slain, and scores of towns and cities throughout Spain over a matter of months. Significantly as well, tens of thousands of Jews thronged to the baptismal fonts in an effort to save their lives and those of their children. This swelled the ranks of these new Christians or conversos, and it really exacerbated the question as to the religious identity of them. What is clear is that following these events of 1391, as we enter the 1400s, Spanish Jewry was but a shell of its former self, and certainly in retrospect, it looks that way. And so by 1415, it's been estimated that perhaps 1/3 of Iberian Jewry had been converted, 1/3 had been slain, and perhaps only 1/3 remained. In 1449, conversos, new Christians, Jews who were had converted, their descendants were these nominal Catholics, they were targeted by law for the first time. Discrimination was sanctioned by law in the city of Toledo. Conversos were barred from holding official positions. And thus was born into Spain and the Iberian Peninsula the concept of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, these racial purity statutes that effectively governed which occupations conversos could hold. Reminiscent of the Lex Visigothorum's racialization of religion 7 centuries earlier, that Jewishness was not a matter of faith, but was something to be seen as innately biological, this would have far-reaching implications. And this is but the prelude to the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition that came in 1478, established by papal decree of Pope Sixtus IV, who allowed Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the so-called Catholic monarchs, or los reyes católicos, to appoint inquisitors to finally inquire into this question of heretical depravity, particularly the heresy of crypto-Judaism. An inquisitor set to work in 1481 and burnt conversos at the stake for this heresy of crypto-Judaism. It's estimated that over the first decade of the Inquisition's existence in the 1480s, 700 conversos were burnt in Andalusia, or the south of Spain, the biblical Sefarad, and 5,000 had their goods or property confiscated. Now, the Inquisition was keen on obtaining a confession, because in their eyes, heresy was perhaps the most grievous sin possible. It put in peril the immortal soul. And so the legal procedures to obtain a confession effectively boiled down to the following. The accused was never permitted to know the identity of the accusers or witnesses against them. Denunciations remained anonymous. And once a denunciation or accusation had been made, a presumption of guilt attached to the accused. They would be arrested, thrown into jail, their property would be confiscated, they would be interrogated and urged to confess for the benefit of their soul. And they would be tortured if need be to extract a confession. The most infamous methods associated with the Inquisition were the garrucha or estrapado, a pulley-based system is seen here, which could dislocate limbs. Toca, the water torture, often referred to as waterboarding in modern parlance, and the potro, or the rack. And this is by far the most common technique utilized according to inquisitorial records. Following this series of procedures, the sentences would be given, and they came down to one of three. The accused could be acquitted, which virtually never happened. The other extreme, they could be relaxed, which was a euphemism for being handed over to the secular arm or authority to be burnt at the stake, particularly if the accused was a repeat or unrepentant heretic. And somewhere between, and the vast majority of sentences, the accused would be reconciled to the church after undergoing a various form of penance. And this culminates in the grand act of faith, or the auto de fe, which consisted of processions of penitence, prayers, and sermons. These could be held in private or public, and that's certainly the image in popular consciousness. And this was the final sentence. This was the moment when the accused would learn what their fate was. In effect, it became a day of judgment for them. The most proximate cause, which led to the Edict of Expulsion, or the Alhambra Decree of 1492, occurred in 1490 to 91. And the Inquisition was most likely instrumental in this. This was the blood libel, which occurred in the city of La Guardia, or LaGuardia in English, nearby the city of Toledo in central Spain. A Christian boy was allegedly kidnapped and killed by Jews and conversos. Although no evidence was ever produced to substantiate this accusation, in November of 1491, Jews and conversos were burnt at the stake. And as you can see, the child, as he was known, El Santo Niño de la Guardia, the Holy Child of LaGuardia became canonized by the church. And again, it certainly contributed to the expulsion, which would occur a mere few months later. But first, the Reconquista came to an end a month and a half later in January of 1492. 8 centuries of Islamic rule came to an end. At this point, as in this magnificent painting by Francisco Pradilla y Ortiz, as seen here, which is currently housed in the Palace of the Senate in Madrid, the last Muslim ruler or sultan, Boabdil or Abdullah, handed over the keys to the city of Granada and especially to the Alhambra, this magnificent citadel and fortress, to Ferdinand and Isabella, to the Catholic monarchs. And with the completion of the Reconquista, with the end of Muslim rule and a unified Christian kingdom, Jewish life became precarious. The conquest occurred in January, but the expulsion itself was not formally decreed until March 31st. It's often referred to as the Alhambra Decree because, again, it was signed in the Alhambra, the last bastion of Muslim resistance to the Reconquista, this magnificent building located at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains, which is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A copy of the order is, of course, seen here. It was signed by the king and the queen, some other officials, and embossed with the royal seal. And the answer, or the reason given or proffered for the expulsion, was that continued Jewish presence made it impossible for new Christians or conversos to fully integrate into Christian society. Openly professing Jews continued to bolster the resolve or the morale of crypto-Jews. And so, following the signing of the Edict of Expulsion, openly professing Jews had at most 3 to 4 months to depart. All Jews were supposed to be gone by the end of July of 1492. They were forbidden to take gold, silver, or precious stones, and they were compelled to sell their landed property. And as news of the Alhambra Decree trickled throughout Spain, and in many cases, it seems to have taken up to another month to fully reach remote communities, Jewish property values rapidly depreciated. In a last desperate attempt to avert this impending calamity stood Don Isaac Abravanel, a Portuguese statesman, diplomat, and according to Jewish tradition, scion of the Davidic house, direct descendant of King David. At this time, he was actually serving as financier or a treasurer to the court of Ferdinand and Isabella. And so, presenting himself before the monarchs, he beseeched them, Ferdinand and Isabella, to rescind the decree, reminding them of the enormous contributions that Jews had made over the centuries to Spain, to the Iberian Peninsula, and to Sefarad. And although accounts vary as to exactly what happened, most seem to attest to some sort of vacillation, especially on the part of Ferdinand. Don Isaac Abravanel was not successful. And so the decree was sealed. How many Jews departed is still a matter of debate more than 5 centuries later. And throughout history, the numbers have varied quite wildly, as seen here. On the shorter end, or much smaller end, we have only 80,000 Jews remained in Spain, up to 800,000 Jews. But what is clear, whatever number we take, the consensus is that only about half the Jews of Spain left or departed. The other half converted to Catholicism in order to remain in their ancestral homeland of 1,500 to 2,000 years. And of course, as many of you may know, the final deadline to leave was on or near Tisha B'Av in August of 1492, or 5252 on the Jewish calendar. And of course, that is the great day of lamentation on the Jewish calendar, commemorating all the tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people through the ages, beginning with the destruction of the 2 temples in Jerusalem. Now, following the expulsion, half of those who left Spain then further separated. And this is truly where we see the beginning of a Sephardic diaspora. Half of the exiles vacated the Iberian Peninsula entirely and went to North Africa or to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Levant, to Egypt, or to Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire, in many cases retracing the steps that their ancestors, that remnant of Judah and Benjamin, had taken following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. But importantly, half of the exiles turned west and entered the neighboring kingdom of Portugal, similar culture, similar climate, similar language. And although in many cases, the memory and legacy of Sefarad was perpetuated, this was nonetheless an abrupt cataclysm. And many scholars have said that from the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE until the Holocaust or the Shoah in our own time and living memory, this was the greatest catastrophe to befall the Jewish people, because there was nothing comparable to the scale or scope. Certainly there had been expulsions before in England, in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, but nothing on the scale of tens to hundreds of thousands of Jews who were evicted from their ancestral homeland in a matter of months. And so looking at the map from a geographical perspective, 1492 truly shattered the unity of Sefarad. Again, the exiles went to North Africa, and this is where we see distinct branches of Sefarad emerging, becoming the North African Sephardim. Those who went to the Eastern Mediterranean became known as the Eastern Sephardim, and those who turned west and entered Portugal, eventually fleeing later on in decades and centuries, and who reverted to Judaism, as we shall see, became the Western Sephardim. And those Jews who were compelled to convert to Christianity but were unable or unwilling to revert to Judaism in previous centuries became their descendants are referred to as the B'nai Anusim, the descendants of the forced or coerced ones. And so following the journey now of those who turned west and entered Portugal, which is truly an untold story, certainly undertold in the annals of history, half of those exiles had entered Portugal under the Portuguese King João II to preserve their ancestral faith and traditions. João died in 1495, and his successor, King Manuel I, is seen here, initially seemed benevolent. The Jews thought they had found a place of refuge. But he sought to wed the Infanta Isabella, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and as a precondition for the marital union, he was made to expel the Jews from Portugal. And so he acquiesced. In December of 1496, he ordered all Jews, Spanish refugees and Portuguese Jews alike, to convert or to leave by October of 1497. In May of 1497, he offered a 20-year period of grace for any Jews who converted to Catholicism. He forbade any inquiry or inquisition into their religious beliefs or actions. But this did not succeed, and it's estimated that by May and June of 1497, 20,000 Jews or so came to Lisbon to depart Portugal, as many of them had departed Spain 5 years earlier. Manuel had promised them ships, but when they arrived in Lisbon, there were no ships to be seen. Instead, Manuel would not permit them to leave. All Jews, tens of thousands of them, were forcibly converted effectively at one time. They instantly became new Christians, or Christaus Novos. Manuel then went further and effectively attempted to extirpate the very memory of Judaism. He ordered synagogues and schools to be closed, prayer books and ritual objects to be confiscated, and even cemeteries to be uplifted. And the Portuguese historian Tavares has referred to this series of actions as religiocide, the attempted annihilation of a faith. And so this truly marks, ladies and gentlemen, a key distinction between Spanish and Portuguese history. In Spain, there had been numerous waves of conversion from Judaism to Christianity over the centuries, beginning with those under the Visigothic king Sigismund in the 7th century. And there had been openly professing Jewish communities living alongside new Christian ones. In Portugal, there was nothing like that. As just aforementioned, tens of thousands of Jews, the entire normative Jewish community, had been converted en masse, rather violently and forcefully. But nonetheless, by the end of the 15th century, in both Spain and Portugal and throughout Iberia, Judaism as a living, breathing, organic faith officially no longer existed on the Iberian Peninsula. And so the people of the book, the term which is usually applied to Jews, became people of memory. There were no longer synagogues or schools, books or study halls, or rabbis. And so accordingly, Judaism, which went underground, became an oral transmission of knowledge centered around the rituals of the home. And women became the primary teachers of crypto-Judaism, confirmed in the inquisitorial records, because they transmitted the rituals, the knowledge, and the faith to the next generation. And consequently, they became the focus of inquisitorial scrutiny and surveillance. Now, another key distinction, which is important to mention, is that crypto-Judaism in Portugal entrenched itself much further, became much more resilient than it was ever allowed to get in Spain. And there are three primary reasons. The first is it was not the native Portuguese Jews alone who were converted. It was a remnant of the Spanish exiles who were as well. And it has to be remembered that they had left Spain in order to preserve their ancestral faith and traditions. They were among a steadfast remnant who held fast to their fathers. And so they were instantly converted en masse together. And so they mutually bolstered one another's faith. Second, Manuel prohibited conversos from leaving the country in 1499 because he feared that they would revert to Judaism if they left the country. And so Individuals who would have left to preserve their Judaism were forced to remain in the country. And lastly, the Inquisition did not yet exist in Portugal. It would not come, indeed, to the country for another 4 decades until 1536. And so crypto-Judaism had 4 decades and had the steadfast remnant in which to acclimate and bolster themselves for the eventual arrival of the Inquisition. And so the lower-ranking clergy and the masses were well aware that many of these Portuguese New Christians or nominal Catholics were secretly practicing Judaism. And in April 1506, during Passover and Easter, when famine and plague afflicted the Portuguese kingdoms, a massacre erupted in Lisbon, directly targeted at the new Christian community. It's estimated that somewhere between 2,000 to 4,000 new Christians or Cristãos Novos were slain throughout the city. In the Alfama, which once housed the Judiaria or the Jewish quarter, or many of the new Christians were dragged to the Rocio Square as seen here and set in huge bonfires, which were set alight as depicted in this wood carving. Manuel was apparently stung by pangs of conscience, and in 1507 he lifted that prohibition on conversos emigrating. At this point, many fled Portugal for new lands of refuge, though after his death, the decision would be reversed once more. In 1521, he died and was succeeded by his son, João III, as seen on the right, and he finally procured from Pope Paul III on the left a papal bull authorizing the establishment of an Inquisition in Portugal. Although new Christians mounted a spirited campaign against it, the first auto de fe occurred in Lisbon in 1540. Now, one of the most significant Portuguese new Christians who fled and who was to affect the course of history was that of Gracia Mendes Nasi. Born in Lisbon in 1510 as Beatriz de Luna, she fled Portugal to Antwerp with her infant daughter in 1538 after her husband died. And this was a mere 2 years after the Inquisition came to Portugal. 1542, she assumed sole control of the House of Mendes, and using her power, wealth, and influence, she developed an extensive escape network, assisting hundreds to thousands of conversos to flee the Iberian Peninsula. She herself was compelled to flee, and she went to the Italian city-states of Venice and Ferrara, whereupon she herself reverted to Judaism and became known by the name which history has given her, Dona Gracia Nasi, or quite simply La Signora, the woman. 1553, she moved to Constantinople, to the Ottoman Empire, where she became a remarkable benefactor or patron of Jewish causes, of yeshivot, of synagogues, of study halls, and famously acquired a long-term lease for the city of Tiberias from the Ottoman government, hoping to spur Jewish settlement in the Holy Land. Today, a museum and a hotel in Tiberias are named for her. Now, in 1580, a dramatic development occurred, which would have dramatic consequences for history. Spain and Portugal effectively merged. They entered dynastic union under Philip II of Spain. And so Portuguese new Christians who had been barred from leaving left Portugal, entered Castile in Spain, and from there went throughout Europe, the Middle East, often rejoining where their Sephardic brethren or co-religionists had gone in 1492, and famously they went to the New World. And so many Portuguese new Christians left that eventually to find a Portuguese abroad was equated with the crypto-Jew. The very term Portuguese became synonymous with crypto-Jew or Judaizer. And so in a sense, the Inquisition defeated its own purpose. It perpetuated the very sense of Jewish identity it was trying to suppress. It expelled Judaism as a living, breathing faith, but not the Jews. Through constantly reminding crypto-Jews by a variety of means of their Jewish heritage, it sustained the heresy of crypto-Judaism. And this was compounded by widespread societal discrimination, particularly manifested in the racial purity laws, those limpieza de sangre statutes, and a Catholic milieu which permeated mental discourse, language, even the physical landscape. And it really forged a converso group identity. And so Portuguese new Christians began to be known as members of the Portuguese nation wherever they went around the globe, La Nación or La Nação. And most significantly, two strains emerged in the crypto-Jewish mind, really from Portuguese new Christians, that of skepticism and Messianism, and they both challenged rabbinic Judaism. Now, in the 1590s, Portuguese new Christians following the Iberian Union came to Amsterdam, but they were secretly worshiping in their homes. But in 1615 or 16, they established a modus vivendi, or agreement with the fledgling Dutch Republic, which had declared its independence from Spain a few decades earlier. They were allowed to openly profess Judaism as long as they did not threaten the integrity of the body politic. In 1639, the Sephardic community of Amsterdam was formally united or unified when 3 synagogues merged. And in 1675, the famous and rather majestic Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, as seen here, was officially inaugurated, quite simply known as the Synagogue. It is the mother synagogue of Spanish and Portuguese synagogues around the world. Now, the story of Uriel Acosta, one of the Portuguese New Christians who came to Amsterdam, tragically exemplifies the situation in which many conversos found themselves. He, as many of these new Christians were, was unfamiliar with normative Judaism. And so when he fled Portugal and came to Hamburg and Amsterdam with his mother and brothers, he encountered rabbinic authority, something he had not known. He did not know the Talmud, and he viewed this as a corruption of the law of Moses. He challenged rabbinic authority repeatedly, and he was excommunicated. He sought to be reconciled to the community, and as a precondition, he was forced to recant publicly, as seen here in the synagogue. This was humiliating to him. He ended up going home, finished writing his autobiography, Exemplar Humanae Vitae, and he ultimately committed suicide. A much younger contemporary who really marked the apogee of skepticism in the Portuguese New Christian world was that of Baruch or Bento Spinoza, later Latinized to Benedictus. Born in Amsterdam to conversos who had reverted to Judaism before he was born, Spinoza seems to have had a traditional Jewish education. Indeed, he was educated at the Talmud Torah school. But in his late teens, early 20s, he came to reject established Jewish beliefs, and by implication, those of Christianity. And so on July 27, 1656, the Ma'amad, or the congregational leadership of the community, issued perhaps the most severe ban or cherem in the history of Judaism. Quote, by decree of the angels and command of the holy men, we excommunicate, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza for his abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. And a copy of the order, seen here on the bottom right, is still extant in the archives of the Amsterdam community. These radical views, which were truly revolutionary for the mid-17th century, were later published in his work Tractatus Theologico Politicus. Among them were his rejection of the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the immortality of the soul, the binding nature of the Torah upon future generations, and even the concept of a providential deity. In Spinoza's eyes, God, what he termed the uncaused first cause, became equated with the totality of creation. As he quite simply put it, Deus sive natura, God or nature. Unlike Acosta, Spinoza never sought to be reconciled to the community. He never attempted to have the banner of the cherem lifted, and indeed it remains in place to this day, but he never converted to Christianity. And so, because in a way he maintained his kinship or affiliation with the Jewish people through a common origin or nationhood, but not by faith, he has sometimes been referred to as history's first secular Jew. One of Spinoza's teachers, that of Menasseh Ben Israel, was born a Portuguese New Christian, Manuel Dias Soeiro. He would move to Amsterdam as a young boy, and by 1650 had become a leading figure in the community, and indeed throughout Europe. In 1655, he went to England, where he directly petitioned Oliver Cromwell, then serving as Lord Protector of the English Commonwealth, or head of state, following the abolition of the monarchy in 1649, to formally readmit Jews to England for the first time since they had been expelled under King Edward I in 1290. Although Cromwell was sympathetic to the petition, he did not formally readmit them. However, he did allow them to stay there effectively unmolested. And so 1655 to 56 marks the return and the resettlement of Jews to England. And following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, King Charles II permitted Jews to remain in his kingdom. And this constitutes the origin of the Sephardic community of London that endures to this day. The Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, which was founded around then, moved to Bevis Marks, to the location it inhabits to this day, as seen in the photos. And that synagogue at Bevis Marks is the only synagogue in all of Europe to have held continuous services for more than 300 years. On the other side of the Sephardic diaspora throughout the Ottoman Empire was that strain of Messianism. And this was exemplified in the figure of Sabbetai Zevi. Born in Smyrna or Izmir, he was extremely charismatic and enchanting, proclaimed the Messiah in 1648, around the same time as Acosta and Spinoza were causing dissension in Amsterdam. And he preached his messianic gospel in the Ottoman Empire in the 1650s, in Alexandria, Jerusalem, Cairo, and Istanbul, including in the Ahrida synagogue that I visited a couple of years ago. Jewish communities throughout Europe and the Ottoman Empire became bitterly divided over his messianic claims. In 1666, he was imprisoned in Istanbul upon the orders of the Sultan, and under threat of death, he converted to Islam, but secretly practiced Jewish rituals. A number of his disciples and their families converted, followed their master, believing this to be a part of the divine redemption. And these individuals, this group of his followers known as the Donme, there is a remnant that survives to this day. And so we will now transition, ladies and gentlemen, from that Mediterranean world here, or milieu of Christendom and Islam and the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and throughout Europe, to cross the Atlantic Ocean, the other side of the world, and see the story of the crypto-Jews or conversos who had gone there, beginning with Christopher Columbus. A number of members of the crew of that first voyage, which departed in August of 1492, the same time as the Edict of Expulsion, were conversos. Indeed, a number had actually converted from Judaism to Christianity a few days before, such as Luis de Torres, the interpreter or translator. Columbus was financed and backed by leading conversos, Luis de San Angel and Gabriel Sanchez. And so for these reasons, many scholars have speculated over the centuries as to what was the religious identity of Christopher Columbus himself, or Cristobal Colon as he was known. The late Estela Rizari, in her work, Christopher Columbus, the DNA of his writings, makes quite a compelling case that in addition to these reasons as aforementioned, there are other reasons that might lead one to believe Columbus was a descendant of Sefarad. Among them were the fact that although he was from Genoa, Italy, he does not seem to have spoken Italian. He communicated in Catalan or Castilian, perhaps even a form of Ladino. Letters to his sons have an acronym at the top, which is known as BH, which is short for the Hebrew phrase Bezrat Hashem, with the help or assistance of God. In his last will and testament, he left money to a Jew in Lisbon and to orphan young girls for dowries, a traditional Jewish bequest across the ages. And he famously delayed the departure from Spain, from the very port of Palos in the south of Spain. The biblical Sefarad is seen here, by one day, so as to not coincide with Tisha B'Av. But notwithstanding if Columbus was himself a crypto-Jew, he certainly lived and operated and was supported by a Jewish and converso milieu. And so following Christopher Columbus, conversos arrived in the New World in the thousands in the following centuries. Those fled from Spain, the Cristianos Nuevos, were followed by Portuguese New Christians, or Cristãos Novos, who came to Brazil following the Portuguese discovery of the country in 1500. Many of them sought to escape the long arm of the Inquisition. Now in 1630, the Dutch fleet captured part of Brazil in the northeast, a state known as Pernambuco, centered around the city of Recife, and they controlled this territory for 24 years. Under the Dutch governor, Johan Maurits, as seen here, he permitted the conversos to openly revert to Judaism. They established a synagogue, Kahal Sor Israel, the earliest in the Americas. And by 1645, the community of Recife numbered, it's estimated, between 1,000 to 1,500 Jews. They were comparable in size to the Amsterdam Jewish community. So accordingly, Amsterdam sent resources and personnel to assist in the continued development of the community, including Rabbi Isaac Aboab de Fonseca, as seen here, who thus holds the distinction of being the very first rabbi in the history of the Western Hemisphere. In 1654, the Portuguese reconquered Recife and Pernambuco and gave the Dutch and the crypto-Jews, who are now openly professing Judaism, 3 months in which to leave. At this point, they effectively had 3 choices. Many stayed in Brazil and moved to the Sertão, the Brazilian hinterland, or the interior of the continent. Others crossed the Atlantic and returned to Amsterdam, including Rabbi Isaac Aboab, who actually became the Sephardic chief rabbi of the community, in which position he presided over the excommunication of Spinoza 2 years later. And others, famously, as the map depicts, island hop throughout the Caribbean to Dutch and English colonies, to Dutch Guiana, now known as Suriname, to Barbados, to Curacao, and to Jamaica. And a very small remnant, 23 Jews from Recife, arrived in the Dutch port city on the east coast of North America, known as New Amsterdam, later renamed to New York in 1664 when the English conquered the colony. The then governor of the settlement, Peter Stuyvesant, asked the Dutch West India Company not to admit the Jews, not to trouble this new colony. Cognizant of their extensive business acumen and incredible trading networks, the Dutch West India Company compelled Stuyvesant to admit them, and furthermore, to give them permission to live, trade, and travel. And so following this admission, they established Congregation Sharit Yisrael, which endures to this day and is the very first congregation in North America. And this marks effectively the genesis, or the beginning, of American Jewish history. And so following their admission to New York, Spanish and Portuguese synagogues and communities were established throughout the East Coast. in Montreal, in Newport, Rhode Island, in Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, complementing synagogues already existing throughout the Caribbean and in South America. And in an indelible testament to that messianic belief, to the yearning for redemption in the crypto-Jewish mind, the synagogue names of these Spanish and Portuguese synagogues evoke salvation. They are all variants of the terms remnant, hope, dispersed, or salvation of Israel. And despite the great struggles that these crypto-Jews faced throughout the Caribbean and the New World, they were so integral and integrated into the very societies that even Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, in his great work, The Wealth of Nations, noted that it was Portuguese Jews persecuted by the Inquisition, stripped of their fortunes, and banished to Brazil who introduced the sugarcane and established the industry. And so looking now at this global circuit, ladies and gentlemen, we can truly see it went around the world with conversos, new Christians, Sfaradim. As the academic Studimant Halevi has noted, Sephardic Jewishness bridged the Caribbean and reached across the Atlantic to the ancestral Iberian Peninsula, to Europe, and even to Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia, which created multiple and intersecting networks. And this truly underpinned the remarkable capacity to cross religious, political, and cultural divides. And so the white arrows represent the Spanish travels, and the blue, the Portuguese. And new Christians were to be found everywhere, in Lima and Panama on the west coast of South America, and Recife and Rio on the eastern coast, and Angola and Mozambique, and Africa, and Goa and Cochin in India, and Macau, Nagasaki, Manila in the Far East or East Asia. This network truly went around the world. And so the Inquisition was quite cognizant of that, and they established a number of branches or tribunals around the world in these Spanish and Portuguese possessions or dependencies, hoping to catch crypto-Judaism even abroad. The Spanish established tribunals in Mexico City, which oversaw Mexico, New Mexico, the future United States, Panama, and even the Philippines across the Pacific Ocean. They established a tribunal in Lima, which oversaw Spanish South America until 1610, when one was established in Cartagena to oversee Colombia, Venezuela, and the Caribbean. The Portuguese established a rather infamous and ruthless tribunal in Goa in India to oversee her colonial possessions in Africa and Asia, and they empowered the bishop in Bahia, then serving as the capital of Portuguese Brazil, to identify and extradite heretics, especially crypto-Jews, back to Lisbon. And so Portugal maintained direct inquisitorial control over Brazil. And so the Inquisition truly became a global reign of terror, and crypto-Jews were caught up in all of this. The geographical and generational scope was unprecedented. Persecution continued unabated for nearly 3.5 centuries on 5 continents. Conversos and suspected crypto-Jews were extradited thousands of miles across oceans and continents, from Brazil to Lisbon, from Manila across the Pacific Ocean to Mexico City. And a number of crypto-Jews, whose story, unfortunately, there's no time to tell today, died in the Law of Moses. These included Luis de Carvajal Almoso and Tomas Trevino de Sobremonte in Mexico City, Francisco Maldonado de Silva in Peru, and Isaac de Castro Tartas in Lisbon, who was burnt alive in the Terreiro de Pazo in the Great Square of Lisbon. In the late 18th century, in the so-called Age of Enlightenment and the period of the American and French revolutions, efforts were finally made to limit inquisitorial excesses. And in Portugal, the great figure was that of the Marques de Pombal, who effectively served as prime minister for 27 years. He was a direct contemporary of the founders of the American Republic, of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, etc. Although he cannot abolish the tribunal at this time, he did manage to abolish slavery, the auto de fe, and the racial purity laws, those limpieza de sangre statutes that distinguished between old and new Christian. And a contemporary of Pombal, the French philosopher Montesquieu, whose great work, The Spirit of Laws, L'Esprit des Lois, would go on to greatly influence the American Constitution and Bill of Rights, noted quite presciently in a remonstrance to the inquisitors in 1748, that if anyone in times to come shall dare to assert that in the age in which we live, the people of Europe were civilized, you will be cited to prove that they were barbarians, and the idea they will have of you will dishonor your age. And so the founders of the American Republic knew that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And even a cursory glance, ladies and gentlemen, at the Bill of Rights makes it evident that it protects against the establishment of any inquisitorial tribunal in the United States. The First Amendment guarantees complete freedom of conscience in religion, speech, press, and assembly. The Fifth Amendment protects against compelled or coerced self-incrimination. The Sixth Amendment famously guarantees the accused the right to confront one's accusers and witnesses against them. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And many scholars have identified this as directly aimed at preventing the introduction of the rack, the wheel, and so forth, infamous methods the Inquisition utilized. And so the inquisitorial tribunals, or the Inquisition, in the mother countries were formally abolished in Portugal in 1821 and in Spain in 1834. And so, beginning to wrap up, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to examine two brief case studies of crypto-Jewish communities that remained on the Iberian Peninsula, that lived in the eye of the hurricane, so to speak, for centuries, those in Majorca and those in Belmonte. In Majorca, the entire Jewish community had been forcibly converted en masse in 1435. And in 1488, inquisitors arrived on the island, while that last generation of survivors of the Great Conversion remained alive. Over the next half century, hundreds of islanders were tried, penanced, and many of them were burnt at the stake for the heresy of crypto-Judaism. The Inquisition seems to have gone relatively dormant, but these crypto-Jews, known as the Shuetas in Majorca, maintained contact with Jewish communities, especially in Italy. But the Inquisition returned with a vengeance 130 years later or so, in the late 17th century, and condemned hundreds of crypto-Jews at scores of autos de fe in a period known as the Cremedissa, or the mass burnings. The most infamous act of faith or auto de fe in the history of the Balearic Islands, which is what Majorca is a part of, occurred on May 6, 1691, when 37 individuals were relaxed and 3 were burned at the stake, including Raphael Valls, the spiritual leader of the crypto-Jewish community, Catalina Tarangi, who urged Valls to hold fast to the law of Moses as they were being burnt alive, and her brother, Raphael Tarangi. And this so-called bonfire of the Jews was witnessed by 30,000 people. Today in Majorca in 2011, or in the 21st century, 10 years ago, the Balearic Islands apologized for this infamous bonfire of the Jews, for persecuting the Shuetas for the very first time in history. And this image shows the regional president of the Balearic Islands shaking hands with Rabbi Nisan ben Abraham, a direct descendant of Catalina Tarangi. That same year, the 18,000 descendants of the Shuetas, or of those Jews who were forcibly converted in 1435, were recognized as Jewish by Rabbi Nisim Karlitz in Bnei Brak, a nephew of the famous 20th century sage, the Chazon Ish. In 2018, a plaque was installed outside the plaza, which memorializes that 1691 bonfire of the Jews. And this very year, as we now are in Sukkot, the very first publicly funded sukkah since before the Inquisition stands in Majorca. In Belmonte, located in a rather mountainous region of Portugal, the Jewish community had been founded in the 13th century. But our story begins in 1917, in the midst of World War I, when Samuel Schwartz, a Polish Jewish engineer, went to that region for work. He encountered a gentleman, Baltazar Pereira de Souza, who said that his family secretly practiced Judaism. Schwartz said that he was a Jew. Not necessarily believing the other, de Souza brought Schwartz to Belmonte to meet the old women, or rezaderas, who were the guardians of the tradition. Remember, crypto-Judaism was an oral transmission of knowledge, and women were the primary guardians of it. He finally convinced the old woman that he was Jewish by reciting the foundational creed of Judaism. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. At the name Adonai, the old woman covered her face and said, he knows the name of our Lord, he is one of us. The crypto-Jews of Belmonte truly believed they were the last surviving Jews on the planet. They had been entirely cut off from contact with all other Jewish communities. Schwartz was welcomed into the community and proceeded to write a book in 1925 detailing the rituals and beliefs of these new Christians. And among them, where they did observe Shabbat to some extent, they lit candles on Friday nights in closets, cupboards, pots, or other hidden places. They baked matzahs or matzot in secret on Passover and held an Exodus, and held a Seder of sorts commemorating the Exodus from Egypt, albeit on a different date on the Jewish calendar, so as to throw inquisitors off the scent. Most significantly, they venerated fasting above feasting and came to elevate Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the Fast of Esther above all else. The crypto-Jews of Belmonte, as I suspect crypto-Jews in other times and places, felt a particular affinity for Queen Esther, the heroine of the Purim story. She effectively became canonized, became the patron saint. For was she not a crypto-Jew herself? The Megillat, or the Book of Esther, says that Mordecai had commanded her not to reveal her people or kindred until the time was right. And indeed, at the end of the story, before Esther, the crypto Jew, went to seek salvation for the Jewish people, she implored all the Jews of Shushan to fast for 3 days. And so women in Belmonte took the command literally, fasting for 3 days, taking turns around the clock. The fast of Esther, in a sense, became transformed to a festival of Santa Esterica, commemorating this crypto-Jewish heroine. They viewed the fast as a symbol of martyrdom, the crypto-Jewish women in Belmonte did, and they viewed it as a source of strength to perpetuate their collective crypto-Jewish identity. They also believed it served as a type of atonement for the sin of living a double life, and they certainly believed it would hasten the coming of the final redemption. Around the same time that Samuel Schwartz went to Belmonte and broke the news of this crypto-Jewish community to the world, emerged a Portuguese army officer, Artur Carlos de Barros Basto, who effectively resurrected the Jewish community in Porto. And he went to Belmonte following this and made great and rather Herculean efforts against great opposition to reintegrate these Moranos Conversos Anusim of Belmonte and the surrounding regions into the normative Jewish community. In 1996 in Belmonte, a synagogue, Beit Eliyahu, was formed, and as the plaque near the entrance reads, "Here in this place, the chain of our tradition has not been severed. As a result of government decrees, the Jewish residents of the village were forced to publicly deny their Judaism, but they maintained it in their homes and in their hearts. Here, the Jewish soul was never lost. Here, it remains forever." In 2005, a Jewish museum was built, and in 2019, the municipality inaugurated a square bearing the name of Samuel Schwartz, honoring the man who did so much to bring Belmonte to the consciousness of the world. That same year, the Jewish community of Porto financed the production of a film, Sefarad, which is on Amazon Prime, detailing the incredible and rather Herculean efforts of Artur Carlos de Barros Basto to reintegrate the crypto Jews into the normative Jewish community. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the legacy of Sefarad lives on in us, in our DNA. A genetic study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2008, which analyzed the Y chromosome of 1,100 men throughout the Iberian Peninsula, found that about 20% are descended from Sephardic Jews, a simultaneous testament to convivencia, to that golden age on the peninsula, as well as to religious and social intolerance, to the forced conversions which occurred over the centuries. An even more groundbreaking study was published in December 2018 in Nature Communications, which analyzed the DNA of about 6,500 people throughout Latin America. And researchers concluded, to their astonishment, that about 1 in 4 Latin Americans, or 25%, are descended from Sephardic Jews or New Christians. And so if we take into account the numbers, there are about 650 million people in Latin America, 60 million Latinos or Hispanics in the United States, and the 20% of modern-day Iberians, at least, who descend from Sefarad. The total number of descendants of Sefarad numbers close to 200 million people around the globe. And while they may not be halakhically Jewish, and while they may not wish to return to Judaism, many of them do. And they form a connection with the people of Israel. They are Zeri Yisrael, from the seed of Israel. And very significantly, they are integral to the story of Sefarad. And so in the end, ladies and gentlemen, this is a call to remember. Moses, the lawgiver, Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom, commanded our ancestors to remember. Near the end of his own life, in Deuteronomy, he enjoined our ancestors, Zechor yemot olam, binu shnot dor v'dor, shalavicha v'yageidcha, zekeinecha v'yom relach. Remember the days of old. Consider the generations past. Ask your father, he will tell you. Your elders, they will inform you. So it's just fascinating to think that some of us not only had ancestors, of course, who once stood at the foot of Sinai together, but who, closer to our own time, actually lived together on the Iberian Peninsula. So this virtual talk is even a reunion of sorts. And so this is it, ladies and gentlemen, a journey of 3,000 years to the ends of the earth, which continues into our own time. The extraordinary saga of Sefarad has changed the course of history and a whole host of human disciplines in genetics, religions, geography, politics, economics, and societies. We realize that the story of Sefarad did not end in 1492 and include only the branches who went to North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean to the Ottoman Empire. It also encompasses those who remained and became the Western Sephardim, who established communities and synagogues in Europe and throughout the New World, and the Bnei Anusim, these emerging communities, members who are coming to the fore, returning to Judaism in our own time. From King Solomon to Hasdai ben Shaprut, Maimonides to Don Isaac of Brabanel, Don Gracia and Nasi to Menasseh Ben Israel, and Raphael Valles to our own ancestors, the story continues into our own time. And so just to wrap up, I myself am a descendant of Sefarad. I just like to share for 2 minutes my own ancestral story. This is an engraving of my ancestor Moses Amon, who fled Granada for the Ottoman Empire as a young boy in 1492. He became a physician to the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He was a patron of Jewish causes. He financed yeshivot and wrote medical textbooks, but famously, he actually interceded on behalf of Doña Gracia Nasi, helping to convince the Sultan to bring her and her family to the safety of the Ottoman Empire. A couple years ago, when I visited Istanbul, I had the good fortune to locate the grave of my grandfather's grandfather, Isaac Amon. Ishaq Amon Effendi, who was a rabbi, professor of mathematics, and a member of the Istanbul Communal Council. He was offered the opportunity to become the Hacham Bash, your chief rabbi, in the early 1920s, a position which he declined. And his wife, my grandfather's grandmother, Kaduno Jalvo Amon, who's seen here, was, according to our family tree, the granddaughter of Haim Palachi, or Palagi, the chief rabbi of Izmir in the 1850s and 60s. Paternal great-grandparents include Hillel Nahmad and Matilde Safra from Aleppo and Beirut, and this is a image of my grandmother's young woman on the top left, and my other great-grandparents, David Amon and Matilde Cohen. And my own paternal grandparents, descendants of Sefarad, Dr. Renee Isaac and Denise Nahmad Amon, Alava Shalom, married in Istanbul in 1952 by the chief rabbi, Raphael David Saban. My grandmother was from Aleppo. My grandfather was the heir to Sefarad. They spoke multiple languages. They always encouraged us to be chic and elegant at all times and to truly take joy in every aspect of life. And so in conclusion, as the late rabbi, Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs put it most eloquently, we did not come from nowhere, nor does our story end with us. We are chapters in a long and still being written story, a letter in the scroll of the book of the people of the book. Take it, cherish it, learn to understand and to love it, and pass it on to future generations, for you are a member of an eternal people. Let their eternity live on in you. And that is the mission of Jewish Heritage Alliance, to preserve this history, memory, and legacy of Sefarad, an untold story which has changed the world. Thank you very much to Olga Lempert, Zach Rothbard, Doron Levin, the National Library of Israel, and all of you for attending. Please feel free to contact me by email or phone if you have any suggestions, comments, or advice, because we are always looking to promote the story of Sefarad to the world at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. That was amazing. There are many, many compliments in the chat and all kinds of very interesting remarks and questions. Obviously, the questions I'll read, but I'll send you the transcript of the chat so you can read all the remarks as well. So the first question was for me regarding the recording. I've posted a link to our website where you can see also the future events and sign up to them and to our newsletter, but also all the past events that we've had. The past few weeks have been kind of hectic with all the holidays and vacation days, so we're a little behind, but hopefully within the next 2 weeks, all of the past events will be up, including this one. The first question for you, Doctor, is from Cassie. She asks, what would you say to those so-called anti-conversos theorists who claim little or no evidence of crypto-Judaism at the end of the 15th century due to the onslaught of mass conversions? I'm also curious, having known Dr. David Gitlitz, I think, how you think he would respond to this. I think it is important to distinguish between conversos and crypto-Jews and not to confuse those terms.
Thank you, Cassie. And don't worry, I was working on a response to your question from another talk. I think it is a good question. And I think Dr. Gitlitz, David Gitlitz, was a man who was a maestro in the field of crypto-Judaic studies. For those who are unaware, his magisterial tome is Secrecy and Deceit, the Religion of the Crypto-Jews, published, I guess, 25 years ago. He tragically passed in December. But he proceeds to, I think, and this is, in my opinion, the answer to your question, that it really goes to what is the question of religious identity, because it's extremely complex, especially in the time in which we live, but even in the medieval age. I think Gitlitz identifies, right, conversos, and you're correct about this, we're not merely crypto-Jews. The problem is when you give a talk, it's very hard to get into the nuances of this. But conversos, it's true, were crypto-Jews, but they also became Catholics. They became skeptics. They vacillated between Judaism and Christianity. And so I accept, of course, we have to make that distinction. Now, in terms of answering anti-converso theorists, I think that is part of the answer, that definitions of Judaism have changed over time. So yes, over the centuries, especially after the great events of the 1490s, the Alhambra Decree of 1492 and the forced conversions in Portugal in 1497, yeah, as soon as that happened, that first generation who knew normative Judaism died out. They were not going to be normative Jews because rituals are going to fade with the passage of time. It was not probably possible to fully or faithfully recreate normative Judaism when there are no rabbis, synagogues, study halls, communal institutions. Everyone is kind of doing it in their own, in the privacy of their own homes. So I think that's kind of my answer, that it's not normative Judaism that crypto Jews, so to speak, were doing in the 1600s, 1700s. But I think if we look at the inquisitorial trial records and some of the stories of Luis de Carvajal Almoso or Isaac de Castro Tardis, they evinced a great degree of respect and affiliation with the Jewish people. They died, in a sense, al Kiddush Hashem, for the law of Moses. They believed in the final redemption. They believed that God would redeem the children of Israel at the end of days. And so, yes, they're not normative Jews. And they were persecuted on racial grounds, certainly is exemplified by the Limpieza de Sangre statutes, these purity of blood laws. But the fact remains, they also identified to a large extent, as seen in Mallorca and Belmonte, with Jewish beliefs, memories, and traditions. And so that's my answer. And I'm happy to have a further follow-up and discussion with you on the topic.
Thank you very much. A few people asked for your email, so maybe if you could write it in the chat room, they can copy it and paste it to further ask you some things. Just want to read out a couple of compliments. Cynthia wrote excellent, filled in some blanks for me. I will definitely rewatch. And Jennifer wrote brilliantly enlightening. Thank you for sharing your incredible knowledge. The next question is by Brian, who wrote, on Tisha B'Av, we mourn the death of the Jews in the Ashkenaz areas that were decimated by the Crusades. Why are there no corresponding kinot, which are bereavement songs, I guess? Why are there no corresponding keynotes about the destruction of the Spanish Jewry? Sorry.
So it's a good question. I think that's part of the testament to the fact that the story of Sefarad remains undertold. It's neglected to some extent in the annals of history, in global and Jewish history. I can't say, again, these are details I didn't have the chance to get into today, but I believe there are, at least in some communities in Italy, there were some keynote after Dona Gracia herself fled to the Italian city-states. So I guess, well, actually a century after Dona Gracia, conversos came to the Italian peninsula in increasing numbers, and they settled in Ancona, which was a port city on the Adriatic Sea, under papal invitation. But in the 1550s, and anyone, of course, is welcome to look this up, the Pope Paul IV actually burnt a number of them, about 24 at the stake as heretics. This scandalized Europe. Or actually it was the time of Dona Gracia, my apologies. Dona Gracia, from the safety of Constantinople, was able to convince Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent to help release a number of the conversos who were languishing in papal jails. But the 24 heretics who died or were executed actually were recited in some keynote in Ancona in Italy. And you can look their names up. They were included among the martyrs. But in direct answer to the question, I think it just really, I certainly believe they should be included. It's not merely the martyrs of the Ashkenazim who were massacred in the First Crusade in the 1090s and throughout history. It includes Sephardim. And so this is certainly something we should work on promoting. I can't say real quick, there's a rabbi in El Paso, Texas, Rabbi Stephen Leon, who in the conservative movement has done a great job. He actually got a resolution passed by the United, I guess the conservative movement, to officially recognize the expulsion and the Inquisition on Tisha B'Av, to not just focus on the Holocaust, but to focus on the devastating consequences which arose as a result of this catastrophe in Jewish history. But it's certainly something we should all continue to push forward to and commemorate even in our own way on Tisha B'Av. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Donna asked, did the Jews ever try to formulate a defense and fight during these slaughters?
You know, it's hard to know. In many cases, Jews were not permitted to effectively have defenses. They often had to rely on protection of governments, the monarchy. In some cases, they did. I'm trying to think of some examples, and this is not even in the history of Sefarad alone. This occurred, I think, in England. They tried to defend themselves, but the thing is, the Jews were always going to be vulnerable. They were a minority, and they were always at the mercy of the crown and of the populace. So even if they tried to defend themselves, that would only enrage, I think, the mob or the populace even further. And so again, I just think that they truly were not able to adequately defend themselves. But of course, that's one of the very reasons, in some sense, why the state of Israel was created in our own time and living memory, so that there would be a state that could defend Jews militarily or physically if need be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joseph asked, why isn't the Chmielnicki massacres also considered a cataclysm in Jewish history, in addition to the destruction of the Second Temple, the expulsion of from Spain, and the Holocaust?
So yes, it would be a catastrophe. Again, it's a detail I didn't include, but this is the backdrop actually against which Sabbetai Tzvi arose. The 30 Years' War, which left millions dead, which reshaped the map of Europe. It devastated that continent. And part of that near the end was the infamous Cossack revolt of Chmielnicki, which slaughtered tens of thousands of Jews. So it certainly is a part of history, and it's a part of the commemoration in a sense. I just didn't include it in the talk because, again, I was trying to get through quite a bit, I guess 3,000 years of history, so to speak. But you are right, it forms an integral part of the story of Jewish history. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sandy asked, what language is the word shwetas that you used?
This is in the Balearic Islands, so off the coast of Spain. It's part of Spanish territory. It's transliterated, I guess, from the Spanish. It's I spell it as Xuetas, but it can also be with the C, Hue. If you look it up, I think you'll be able to find it out. But it was Spanish territory, so I would think Spanish, but I'd have to double check on that.
Thank you very much. Sandy also asked, why only men's DNA tested? Robert answered her that the Y chromosome changes faster than the X, so it is better at tracing families, but do you have anything to add to that?
So that is a good point. I don't know why in that 2008 study they only tested the Y chromosome. It may be because it's easier along those lines, that's transmitted from father to son virtually unchanged across the generations. That 2018 study, though, which gives us that 25% number, the 1 in 4 Latin Americans descend from Sefarad, I think was tested along both the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. So I don't know, again, why specifically the 2008 study didn't include, but it just goes to further show if 20% of just Iberian men are descended from Sefarad, the number, if we include women, must certainly be higher. Okay.
Thank you very much. Lori, Ilana also asked something connected to this question, but Lori asked, was there an economic motivation behind the Inquisition?
Probably. Now, this has been advanced perhaps somewhat by Benjamin Netanyahu, who really drew it along racial lines, but the great Portuguese historian, Antonio José Saraiva, says in his great work, The Murano Factory, that is why the Inquisition did it, because these conversos were accumulating so much wealth, they effectively were forming a middle class, which threatened the economic system. And so they were targeted to confiscate their wealth. again, I think that's certainly a motivating factor. I don't think it's the only explanation, because I don't think, just to expand, I don't think that any one explanation has total explanatory value. Certainly, it could have been a product of anti-Judaism, of racism, of pathological obsession with purity of blood, with economic discrimination, with wanting to reunify the peninsula and expelling all minorities who didn't fit into that dominant majority. I think it's all together that we can truly see the picture. There are a number of factors which led to this, again, this abrupt catastrophe in history. But economic discrimination, I would accept as certainly one of the reasons why the Inquisition was established. And I think that even if it wasn't the initial reason, it certainly became over time, because once the accused had been condemned, their property would be confiscated. And one of the various forms of penance would be permanent confiscation of goods or property. Well, that certainly provides motivation to find the person guilty of heresy, because, well, who gets their property? Not their heirs. They're attainted forever. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. Robert asked a huge question, but he's asking for your opinion. So he says, your opinion, please. Why do you think anti-Semitism started and continues?
Well, this is the foundational question, and it's very difficult to give a single reason. I think that really it goes to show, because Jews are different. They've always been viewed as different, no matter how integrated they may have been into the host society. As the late Rabbi Sachs put it, right? It's really, it changes, it mutates. It's like a virus, I guess, in the sense like COVID. It mutates no matter what we throw against it. I think because it's just, Jews are a distinct minority. They almost always have been in history, and it's easy to scapegoat them. And so that's why they have been targeted, right, in the past on anti-Jewish lines, on racist, or again, purity of bloodlines, and on economic grounds. It's just a combination of factors. It's very difficult to give one reason, but the fact is it goes back very far. In fact, I can tell you, I think that anti-Semitism in some sense, I mean, it began even in very early on in the book of Exodus. The Haggadah, and the Haggadah, the actual story of the Exodus from Egypt, do we not say Pharaoh himself said, well, we should target them lest these Jews increase and challenge the country? Well, what did they do to ever threaten? They had only contributed to the Egyptian economy and society. And so I guess they feared that Jews would, for some reason, turn against them. So I don't know of any exact reason, but it's certainly something we should always be on the lookout for, because it mutates, unfortunately, again, like a virus in every age. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very, very much, Dr. Isaac Amon. Again, there are so many compliments in the chat room. I will definitely send you the transcripts so you can read them all. I'm going to open microphones for whoever's in the panelist room. And if anyone who is an attendee who also wants to ask a question aloud or just say hi, just raise your hand and I'll promote you to panelist as well. Once again, thank you all for coming in from all over the world. It's an honor and a pleasure to see you all here with us. Chag Sameach, Moadim Nesimcha, and Laila Tov from Jerusalem. The microphones are open, and whoever's would like to be promoted to panelists to open their microphone, just raise your hand and I'll move you over also.
Thank you. It's a wonderful lecture. Very informative.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
Did you apply for the Spanish citizenship?
Not Spain directly. I've been working on the Portuguese, actually. A bit easier to get than the Spanish version. Although I have to tell you, COVID's drawn out the process quite a bit. So I'm still in the midst of it, but I'm certainly looking to return. I have visited Spain and Portugal. I was actually in Portugal prior to the pandemic. I was researching in the Iberian Peninsula. So I'd certainly, God willing, like to get the citizenship and return to the homeland, so to speak. Yeah.
We're writing a book on the Spanish law of citizenship. Would love to have your contribution. I'll write you directly.
Okay, thank you very much. I have my email. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
How long did it take you to find that extraordinary genealogy?
Oh, of my own ancestors?
Your own personal ancestry. It's just amazing.
Well, thank you. It's taken quite a bit. I was fortunate. I mentioned my own grandparents of blessed memory. ever since I was a kid, I imbibed history from them. My grandparents knew quite a bit of their own family tree. Something that certainly helped, though, was when I went to Istanbul a couple of years ago. I was privileged to actually meet a cousin of my grandfather who still lives there. And in his possession was a family tree, which went back, I don't even know, 5, 6 generations. Now, the story of Moses Amon, to be honest, we can't prove at this moment direct descent, but certainly that's where the tradition of our family comes from by numerous branches. I also did 23andMe, and I've connected with, relatives, cousins across the world. And all these Amon branches, I might add, have a tradition of descending from Sefarad and of this Moses Amon as perhaps the progenitor of the dynasty. It was also mentioned, I might add, in the Encyclopedia Judaica. And actually, the National Library of Israel was quite helpful. At the beginning of the year, I wrote an article, which was published by them in the Librarians blog, and then later in the Jerusalem Post. So it was kind of piecing together various things. But it's taken me quite a bit, but I did have a head start with my grandparents assisting me. So, thank you.
I just
Thank
want to
you.
congratulate Isaac for another amazing presentation.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Michael Steinberger, the founder and CEO of Jewish Heritage Alliance. And so, yeah, thank you, Michael, for all your
Absolutely,
support and everything you do. Thank you.
My
My family, I'm Stella Benson, Cansino by birth.
Hi, Stella.
We've got the history back to about 1381 in Seville with the Merc killings, and my ancestor Pedro was one of the first to be burned to the stake in Seville in 1481. And we always believed it was to do with wealth, because his wife, who I don't think was Jewish, owned a lot of properties. But then the rest of the family left in 1492 went to Iran and eventually landed up in England. And my mother's family came from Portugal, Nunes Cavallo, via Holland to London. So,
oh, very nice. Yeah, for sharing. It's so your ancestor was among those mentioned when I said in 1481 the first.
Yeah, that's why I put a little comment up there that he was actually one of those. Yes. Wow.
And yet you're still here. So this is
my father and his late uncle, who lived in Richmond, Virginia, but had lived in Morocco, got out in 1940, whenever the Germans invaded, and they worked on it very hard. And my brother's taken it over, and he's done a lot with it over the years. The family history.
Well, that's very nice.
Both families. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Sephardi on my father's side and Ashkenazi on my mother's side. So it's difficult to try to do for me on both, but I'm certainly.
Well, we have a little bit. My grandmother's family were Ashkenazi from Hamburg, I think. No, not Hamburg, but anyway, Germany. Yeah. But the one thing about the Sephardim, certainly in Spain, it's easier to find. The records were kept much easier. And Germany, they were burned. A lot of them went.
Right.
Spanish heritage is much easier to find.
Yeah, that's very true. And actually, I'll just share too that in some of the other talks I've given, even at local synagogues, I'm speaking from the American Midwest, that a lot of Ashkenazim come up and they say something similar. How do you know your history that far back? We know more than just a few generations. So it's
much easier for us to trace. Yeah.
Certainly true.
My niece and nephew are applying for Portuguese citizenship at the moment, or trying to.
Jonathan Feingold, do you have a question?
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question I would like to ask, if possible. Could you comment on the idea that the Jews that particularly left, as opposed to staying and trying to convert to Christianity on the surface, were the more religious and the more, or how shall I say, the more ultra-Orthodox of and following everything of the people there? And so the ones that left were more religious and the ones that stayed were more secular.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I do think there probably was some aspect of religiosity that went into it, but I also think it's a product of one's, I think, economic circumstances, because one had to be able to have, I think, enough funding or resources even after everything was effectively confiscated to leave, it would take much to traverse, right, to go to North Africa or the Ottoman Empire. I think that many people really thought they could find safety or refuge in Portugal, right across the border. Similar culture, similar climate, similar language.
And close.
And very close, right. And not only that, as seen, I mean, they really formed that nucleus of crypto-Judaism that persevered for centuries. So they remained very attached to their ancestral faith and traditions. If not for them, very likely everyone would have, or a much greater majority or proportion of the Jewish population would have melted away.
Now, as we know, the Ottoman Empire, the actual Sultan invited the Jews
right.
from Spain to come, and he just built a very nice new shopping center, which is still in existence, and he wanted merchants because he wanted to bring back the economic prosperity to the city they basically had been in decline and they'd only recently conquered, actually in 1453. So there's definitely some element. There was some talk that they sent the ships, but one doesn't know.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Bruce Kahan or Sandra, you have a question? Your hands are raised.
Yes, thank you. Greetings from Stanford and California. So this is truly global. This is amazing scholarship. My question is, how do you make sense of the role of the Sephardim in their migrations as, in effect, the Bloomberg terminal, the trustworthy informations from all these different ports and communities of resources? How did that help to preserve and encourage preservation of their Jewishness, to know that they would have an economic role in these other territories?
Thank you for the question, Bruce. I do think there's a role. I don't know specifically about, as you mentioned, Bloomberg terminals, but certainly that map I showed, showing that global circuit, I think it really played a role. And this is interesting because they didn't define themselves by religion alone. It was that shared concept of nationhood or identity. They were people of the nation, no matter, even if they were not necessarily Jewish. They really viewed themselves as forming a single unit. And so, yes, I think the very fact they contributed economically, and again, as Adam Smith himself acknowledged in The Wealth of Nations, it really helped to preserve these faith and traditions. I think they really thought, even if they weren't quote unquote ultra Orthodox or Jews, they formed a part in a connection in this unbroken chain of the generations. And as we see again, these Portuguese Jews, it was the Western Sephardim who founded and created the Spanish Portuguese synagogues that endure to this day throughout Europe and the New World. Without them, history would have been vastly different. Yeah, thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
So
Please
my
feel
question-
yeah, go ahead, please.
That I was actually in Spain this summer unexpectedly, and in Toledo, Cordoba, and Sevilla.
Oh, very nice.
And the guide we had told us that specifically that Isabel had ransomed her jewels in order to pay Columbus to fund his expeditions, because she didn't have any money. All the wars, were very expensive, but they were constantly fighting each other. And that by expelling the Jews, there was a huge financial gain because she didn't have to pay back the money to get her jewels back. She just got them. And therefore she could give him the money so he could sail. And that the Inquisition itself was not funded by the state. It was funded by the money they took from all the people they accused. So there was a huge financial incentive to keep, it was a self-funding expedition, the Inquisition, that they weren't getting money from any source other than the people they actually were accusing and harassing. The last question I have, though, is why is Spain offering citizenship to people? I don't really get this, because as you're showing, the numbers are enormous. They could have done the math themselves.
Right.
And figured out that people who, from the expulsion, there are people all over the world. They're not Jewish per se, what we would consider Jewish, but they can prove their ancestry. They don't really want millions of people. I don't understand what their motivation is. They think this is reparation. I don't get it.
It may be a combination. It's certainly proffered as a form of compensation or reparations for the expulsion, but in Spain, and I'm sure people listening in can certainly testify to this, they placed a ton of obstacles in the way. That's why I myself didn't even apply to Spain, and I can, in a sense, go back there. I mean, genetically, genealogically, the Portuguese route was much more viable. I mean, Spain, you have to speak Spanish, you have to go there, you have to have some connection and property and so on and so forth. I think it was it's meant to be a gesture. I think we certainly think the zeitgeist, the times in which we live, re-examining the past, the atrocities and so on and so forth, really compelled them in some sense to make this gesture. And they certainly didn't expect millions of people to return. I think the numbers are something like, what, 160,000, 180,000 applications, but they approved a fraction. I mean, I don't know, 30,000, 50,000, something like that. So I don't think they expected. I think they wanted to get, in many cases, the publicity and the fanfare of doing it. But then privately, they make it very difficult to actually go through the process. And I know the New York Times had an article not that long ago about many of the obstacles people are facing who have spent tens of thousands of dollars in trying to get that citizenship. So again, I think it's for publicity's sake. Yeah. And if I can just add one thing, Sandra, too, that's what's his name? Herbert Adams in 1892, on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, wrote, right, that's the myth that Isabella pawned the jewels. And he put it in 1892 in his book. I don't remember the title, but he says it was not jewels, but Jews who funded the first expedition of Columbus. and as you said, and I think as I answered in another question, right, the Inquisition confiscated the property and the wealth. So, well, if we know they're going to be convicted heretics' property is going to be confiscated, then, well, what other motive do we need to, well, they are heretics. And their heirs would not inherit that property because, again, it was an eternal tainting of the line. They would never get it. So, yeah. Thank you.
I would like to ask a question about the Caribbean. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
this is absolutely fascinating, unbelievable. I definitely am Ashkenazic. I knew nothing. I went to yeshiva my whole life, and yet I was told nothing, which is really very upsetting to me, just in the fact that it wasn't a part of the, of my education, very, very minimal. But the Caribbean, I've been reading the book, The Jewish Pirates in the Caribbean by Edward Crinsley. Mm-hmm. And when the first time we went to the Caribbean, I can't even remember which, I think it may have been Jamaica, I'm not sure. And I was like amazed, but in fact, the Jewish people were all over the Caribbean, all over, all these different islands. Have you done research about that? Are there, ongoing Jewish communities there? Has been there a lot of intermarriage with the native people of the different Caribbean islands?
So I think, again, this does truly form part of that untold story that has changed the world. I don't know what the exact situation is. I actually recently spoke with someone from Jamaica, one of the members in the Jewish community there, who did say yes. I mean, there are small communities that still are there. I think at most on some of these islands, and I could be wrong certainly, but there's just a few hundred left at most, because a lot of the economic opportunities are elsewhere. But you're certainly right that they influenced these islands immensely, and a lot of the synagogues there, right? If you visited them too, as I said, they still endure to this day. I mean, they're among the earliest and the ones that still exist, and a lot of them have the sand floors, testament to. I don't know if you saw that when you were there, but they have these sand floors that, in a sense, have been said to be kind of a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt, going across the desert, but more significantly, a remembrance of crypto-Judaism, of their ancestors who had to tiptoe, as it were, right, to worship in secret. So yeah, it's certainly an undertold story. There's a guy, professor, I don't know him personally, but I think he recently published a book called Stan Mervis, who's in Arizona, and his book is on the Jewish Jamaica, something like that. I'm actually going to try to get the book myself in the near future. So I hope that kind of answered your question.
Thank you. I think we have only time for maybe a couple more brief questions. George Felipe has been waiting for a while. Do you have a question, George?
Oh, no. I'm interested on the history as a whole, but I don't really have a question at this very moment.
Thank you very much, Lori.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hi from Kibbutz Sarid in Israel.
Hello. Hi.
I'm originally from Seattle, and we have a wonderful Sephardic community there. I think it's the third or fourth largest in America, after New York, LA, Atlanta, as far as I know. And most of the people came from either Rhodes or Istanbul, Turkey. And when I was in Rhodes recently, I saw on the plaque, memorial plaque of one of the synagogue there, many of the same names of the families that I grew up with in Seattle, the same names exactly. And I was wondering, just to ask a Jewish geography question, if you have any relatives in Seattle, because my father's, he was a physician, and one of the people he took care of was named Saul Amon, who worked in the Pike Place Market, which is a wonderful tourist attraction with a fantastic fish market. That's the Amon family. It's the same name as yours. And I was wondering if you have any relatives there. We also, by the way, have a new Sephardic studies program at the University of Washington. I was wondering if you knew anything or if you were involved with that at all.
Okay, well, thank you for the questions. And I think one, I am familiar with the Sephardic Studies program and Devin Nar, who's there. I'm not personally involved, but certainly when Jewish Heritage Alliance is looking to grow, the organization I'm at, we certainly will be reaching out to universities and academics to continue to tell the story. And then regarding your question about Seattle, so I've never been, which I hope, God willing, one day soon to do. I don't know the exact connection, but I have found, you are correct, some Amons who live there. We don't know the exact connection. There's probably a remote ancestor. But yes, I actually connected with one on Facebook not too long ago who mentioned to me her father was Amon from Turkey, Amon or Amon. And ultimately, again, that name is just Hamon with the hey in Hebrew. But in the Sephardic pronunciation, that hey would have remained silent, so it would be pronounced Amon anyway. And then in English, it was changed from the H to the A, but that's a whole story. But yeah, there very well could be, and I hope to have the opportunity to meet some of these relatives in Seattle. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you once again, Dr. Amon. Thank you all for being here. Hope to see you in our next events. Thank you all for coming from all over the world. It was beautiful to see you and to hear you. And Laila Tov from Jerusalem and Chag Sameach.
Thank you. Chag Sameach, everyone. And again, please feel free to email me or you have my contact information. I'm more than happy to hear from you and help in any way that I can. So, yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. Thank you.